Yeah, so you guys all hear me? Apparently you can. That didn't just make this any harder, so thanks for that. As the man says, I am the very recent VP of Consulting Services, which means I am managing, I don't know how many consultants we have these days, 20, 21, 22 software developers, coaches, designers, that kind of thing, so may God have mercy on my soul. So I have kind of a different kind of talk for you today. And it's a talk that Karen sort of paved the way for with her story the other day, yesterday. Because I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story that is really close to my heart. And I think it's a fun story. I think if nothing else, the last session of this conference, we'll have some fun and we'll sort of enjoy a good story. But I also think that this story is a story that can inform the things that we do every day as software developers, as people who build things. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you this story, and then I'm going to circle around at the end and try and make the case that this story is relevant to what you do every day in little ways and in really big ways. So here goes. Here comes my story. It's the summer of 1969, and it's hot. I mean, it is really hot. And when it gets hot like this, the world kind of goes a little crazy. People kind of go a little crazy. So here in the summer of 1969, there are all kinds of things that are going crazy. And I'll tell you, one of the craziest things is that regular people here in the summer of 1969, regular people are starting to put air conditioners in their houses. I mean, I'm not talking about rich people, and I'm not talking about movie theaters or supermarkets. I'm talking about regular people putting air conditioners in their houses. Can you believe that? It's just the strangest thing. And you know what else is crazy here in the summer of 1969? You better have that air conditioner in your house because you know how much a Coke costs now? A bottle of Coke has gone up to 10 cents. 10 cents for a bottle of Coke. It's a glass bottle with some soda in it, and it's 10 cents. I mean, it's just nuts. And then, if you want to go for real nuts, the New York Mets, those bums of an expansion team, they've never had a winning season. And here in the summer of 1969, these bums are beating everyone. There's even talk. I can barely say it. There's even talk that they might go to the World Series. It's just too awful to contemplate. But what is awful here in the summer of 1969 is that the Cold War has entered its 25th year. There's us over here and the Russians, as we call them, the Soviet Union over there, and we have been locked in this not quite peace, not quite war thing for 25 years. In Berlin, they're on one side of the street with their tanks, and we're on the other side of the street with our tanks. The guns are pointed at each other, and everybody's just been sitting there waiting for the other person to make the first move, or make the first mistake, or to sneeze. And you better hope nobody sneezes, because they have tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. We have tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and let me tell you, if those bombs start flying, we are all dead. If those bombs start flying, if somebody pushes the actual button, we have 15 minutes to live, because that's how long it takes for those bombs to get to their targets. So we are living here in the summer of 1969, 15 minutes at a time. But for once, it's not the New York Mets, it's not the Cold War, it's not even the heat that is filling up all the papers here in the summer of 1969. For once, it's something else. It's Apollo. It is the project to land a person on the moon. But don't get me wrong, Apollo is all about the Cold War. See, in the early 60s and the late 1950s, the Russians were making us look bad. They were doing everything in space first, and they were making us look bad. And when you were involved in this conflict, where you were trying to tell people all around the world, be on our side, we're the smart ones, we're going to win. You can't afford to look bad in something like space. So the Russians, they launched the first Earth satellite. They put the first person in orbit. They got the first picture of the far side of the moon. Really crappy picture, but it's a picture nevertheless. So it was like a chess game. The Cold War is like a chess game. They do something, we do something. So they were first in space and all these things. We had to do something. So John Kennedy was president back then, and he reasoned that if you're behind in a race the way we were behind in that race, it's better to be behind in a marathon than it is in a 50-yard dash. Why? Because you can catch up in a marathon. There's lots of time to catch up. So Kennedy just decided to declare a marathon. He got his advisors together, and he said, where can we go in space that's really far away, that'll be hard to do, that'll be a marathon? And his advisor said, well, the moon's pretty far away. And he said, okay, we're going to the moon. It's a completely arbitrary goal. And we need a timeline. We need a deadline. 1970 is a nice, good round number. We're going to the moon by 1970. Completely arbitrary goal, completely arbitrary deadline. No one here has ever experienced that, have they? So Kennedy got up in front of Congress, and he said, we're going to send a person to the moon and bring them back safely before 1970. A funny thing happened right after that. People started looking at each other, and they would say, wait a minute. Yeah, it's all about the Cold War. We all know it's all about the Cold War, but wait a minute. Yeah, we're going to the moon. The moon, yeah. I mean, we're going to the moon. I mean, people have dreamed about going to the moon for thousands of years, and it's going to be us. We're going to be the people who do it. How cool is that? I don't care it's for the Cold War. This is really good. And so you could tell a few months after that first speech, you could tell, Kennedy made a second speech, and you could tell he caught a little bit of the fever. He caught a little bit of the fever because in that second speech, he said, we choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's an interesting way of looking at life. Well, how hard is it to go to the moon? Well, it really all depends on how far away the moon is, right? So, I have to do this, right? You always, whenever you talk about astronomical distances, you need your little analog, right? So I got a tennis ball here, okay? And then if this is the Earth, then I got this little rubber ball. See how small it is? No wires. Got this little rubber ball here, and if this is the Earth, then this is about the right size for the moon. So now I want you to think about your 6th grade physical science textbook. There'd be a picture of the Earth and the moon. How far apart are they? I think in my textbook they were like this, right? That picture is more about getting the Earth and the moon on the page. The Earth and the moon are not this close. They're not this close. They're not this close. They're not this close. My arms aren't long enough. They'd be about 7 feet apart. So now here's the key question. How far, Kennedy said we were going to go to the moon, and we had already started sending people a little way up into space. You know how far we had gotten into space? Not quite as high as the fuzz on this tennis ball. We hadn't made it out of the fuzz yet, and suddenly we're going 7 feet by an arbitrary deadline. Going to the moon is really, really hard. So if you got this like crazy deadline and this crazy project, how do you even start? Like, what do you do? How do you even get going? I'm not sure what the right thing to do is, but what they actually did was everything all at the same time. They started a whole series of projects, everything they could think of all at once, and the prayer was that it would all come together at the last minute, right? So that's always a good plan. So, for instance, one of the things they decided to do was try and simplify the job, right? The job is take a person, take them to the moon, land them safely, bring them back to the Earth. Well, we can't all do that all at once, so what's the simplest thing that could possibly work? Well, we could build a spaceship with no person, send that to the moon and bring it back. That has got to be easier, right? You take the people out of the equation, it's got to be easier. Okay, is that the simplest thing that could possibly work? No. If you're just sending a machine to the moon and landing it on the moon, you don't have to bring it back. So the simplest thing that could possibly work is just send the machine and land it on the moon. Is that the simplest thing that could possibly work? Not quite. We need to think about what the word land means. How about if we define land as go screaming in at 1,200 miles an hour flat, okay? And we can take some pictures on the way, that kind of thing. Thus was born Project Ranger, to hit the moon with a spaceship. Ranger 1 was launched in August of 1961, and it succeeded beyond everybody's expectations if the goal was to crash. Ranger 1 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Ranger 2 did better, it crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Ranger 3, by any measure, did better. It made it all the way out to the moon. It had a little navigation problem and kind of missed 100,000 miles or so. Ranger 3 is still out there. Ranger 4 actually hit the moon, but Ranger 4 died on the way to the moon. It died on the way to the moon, and the stone-dead spacecraft looped around and we believe hit the far side of the moon. That was success of some form. Let's see, 5. Ranger 5 was worried about Ranger 3 and joined it in the great beyond. Ranger 6 flew a flawless 3-day mission to the moon. It takes about 3 days to get to the moon. And at a certain point, on that third day, the people behind Ranger 6 realized that neither God nor Isaac Newton was going to keep this thing from hitting the moon, and the spacecraft was working, and the only thing left to do was have the TV cameras come on so that they could see the moon getting closer and closer and closer. So they commanded the TV cameras to come on, and they didn't. And so they crashed a blind spacecraft into the moon, almost. Ranger 7 actually worked. Ranger 7 actually flew to the moon, took a bunch of pictures, and hit the moon. And you can imagine there were a lot of corks popping and champagne being drunk after Ranger 7, except those people had to be standing there thinking, my God, it took us 7 tries in 2 years to do the simplest thing that could possibly work. How in God's name are we going to do the rest of it? And the answer is, again, they did everything all at the same time. So one of the things they realized is they were building these huge going to the moon rockets, but they were not going to be ready in time to train the astronauts. So they built a whole separate thing just to train the astronauts. This is Gemini. It's a 2-person spaceship, and it was built for no other reason than to train the astronauts, train people in the things you needed to know to go to the moon. So astronauts would go up and practice astronauty going to the moon things in Earth orbit. And they learned a lot from Gemini. They learned something about the little steering rockets on a spaceship. Every spaceship has these little steering rockets that point it, make it, nose up and nose down, the kind of thing an airplane does with flaps, but spacecraft don't have any air. They learned what happens if one of those rockets malfunctions and goes on and stays on and just keeps firing. And the answer is your spaceship starts to spin faster and faster and faster. And they learned that when that happens, the people inside the spaceship can no longer see because their eyeballs are getting, sloshed around. But the other thing they learned is that if you have an astronaut with dead calm nerves who is well enough trained that he can work the problem while his spaceship is tumbling out of control and knows the inside of his cockpit so well that he can find the right switches to throw without being able to see, this is a survivable accident. And they survived it. That's something good to know. They also learned something about spacesuits. They weren't too worried about spacesuits, get a rubber suit, insulate it, put a helmet on it, some oxygen, send the guy out into space. What they discovered is if you take a person, put him in a rubber suit, insulate it, put a helmet on it, send them out in space and have him exercise, he gets hot. He gets so hot that he starts to edge up towards heat exhaustion. I mean, who would have thought, right? Insulated rubber suit, right? And it also, the person doesn't just get hot, they sweat. And so the suit fills up with perspiration, so it's yucky as well as dangerous. That was something to know. While all this is going on, while they are continuously trying to hit the moon with dead spacecraft, while they're doing all this other stuff, they are building these huge workshops. And they're building these huge workshops so they can build these enormous going to the moon rockets. And this is the result of all that. This is the largest rocket ever built. It is 25 stories tall. It weighs millions of pounds. If the fuel in that thing goes off in an accident, it'll be an explosion the size of a very modestly sized nuclear bomb. And the whole thing only has one purpose. The whole thing, its only purpose, is to throw the very tippy top, the very pointy bit that you can barely see in this picture, see it better here, at the moon. Because the result of yet another project is this thing, the very pointy bit at the top, which is a spaceship designed to take 3 people on the trip to the moon, let them spend some time on the moon, and have them come back. It has the air, the fuel, the oxygen, heat shields, parachutes, everything you need. It is a marvel of 1960s technology. There's only 2 things wrong with it. Thing number 1 is it killed its first crew. They weren't even flying in space. They were just practicing on the launch pad. Let's pretend to be launching. And a fire broke out inside the spacecraft. Some kind of electrical problem, who knows? 3 times the ground crew tried to fight their way in to get those people out. 3 times the flames and the heat and the smoke drove them back. On the 4th time, they managed to get the hatch open. There was nobody left to save. That's thing number 1. But here in the summer of 1969, those problems have been fixed. We've fixed the problems in this thing, we're pretty sure, 99% sure we fixed them, because we're in a hurry. The other problem with this thing is that with all the food and the air and the heat shields and the parachutes, it's actually too heavy to land on the moon. It can go from the Earth, it can go to the moon, it can orbit around the moon, it can come back, but it can't make that last 30 or 40-mile journey down to the moon. It's just too heavy. So for that, we have this. This bizarre-looking contraption is a fragile, very specialized spaceship. Its only purpose is to take 2 of the 3 people, so one guy gets left behind in the mothership, kind of to watch the store, take 2 of the 3 people down to the moon. It's actually a fairly complicated spaceship. It's actually a 2-stage rocket. There is an engine and fuel tank to land, and there's a separate engine and fuel tank to come back up, which is important only because if you're landing and you change your mind and you want to go back up, there's a fairly complicated procedure you need to go through to do that, and you'll see why that's important in a little while. So these 2 things will go out to the moon carrying these guys. This is the crew of Apollo 11. They're the first people to attempt to land on the moon. This guy, closest to me, is Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin's a pretty good guy to have on this trip because he is one of the key people who fixed the problems with the spacesuits. Because you know what? He's got to wear one, right? So he is probably a pretty good guy to have on this kind of trip. We've already met the guy on the far end. He's the other guy who is going to attempt to actually land on the moon. He's Neil Armstrong, and he was the guy in that spinning spacecraft who managed to right it without being able to see what he was doing. Can you imagine why they picked him? The guy in the middle is the guy who's going to stay on the mothership, and he's got the suckiest job in the world, in the universe. His job is not sucky because he doesn't get to land on the moon, although that's part of it. His job is sucky because of the what ifs. What if the other 2 go down to the moon and can't come back up? What if something happens to them on the way down to the moon? What if something happens to them on the moon? Colin's job, the guy in the middle, his job is to leave his friends behind and make the 3-day silent, sad journey back home. That has got to be the suckiest job in the universe. It is July 20th, 1969. It's a Sunday. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A few days ago, Apollo 11 took off. They've had a textbook journey to the moon. A couple of hours ago, those two spaceships separated. The mothership stayed in orbit, and the little lander, this weird-looking contraption, has been on its way down to the surface of the moon for the last couple of hours. And they are about to enter the critical last 10 minutes, what NASA calls powered descent, the last 10 minutes of the trip down to the moon. Back on Earth, in Mission Control, there is a room full of people who are arming for war. A lot of these guys are in their 20s. They have spent a substantial portion of their adult life waiting for these 10 minutes. It's oddly silent in that room, and they are deadly serious. The door is locked. There's an armed guard on the other side of the door. No one is getting in or getting out until this thing is over. They've locked down the circuit breakers on a lot of their important equipment. They would rather risk a fire than have the lights go out at the wrong moment. Their job is to watch the data streaming down from the spaceship and be the third, fourth, fifth, 27th pair of eyes to make sure that that weird-looking little spaceship is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Across the United States, there is this blanket of tension everywhere. The streets are eerily empty because most people are inside, glued to their TVs. It's right around now, right around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that something weird starts to happen with the cars that are on the road. They start to pull off. In city streets, they find a place to park. On highways, they pull off onto the shoulder. On rural roads, they simply stop. The drivers cannot listen to their radios, listen to what is going on above the moon, and drive at the same time. In a row house in Philadelphia, a 10-year-old boy and his dad are watching the coverage on TV. It's right around now, they're both sitting on the couch, but it's right around now that the dad gets up, walks about halfway to the TV, and gets down into this sort of catcher's crouch and puts his hand on his head. And that's the way he'll stay until it's over. They're watching this guy, this is Walter Cronkite. He is like the god of TV newsmen. They do public opinion surveys. What public figure do you trust? The President of the United States regularly comes in second. This guy wins. Cronkite is one of these, like, nothing bothers him kind of reporters. In World War II, when he was a radio reporter, he flew on bombers just so he could say, tell the people back home what it was like, even though those bombers were getting shot down at a rate of 10% per mission. Many people remember Cronkite with just a touch of sadness in his voice, telling the world that John Kennedy had been murdered. It is 4:05 p.m. It's right at the beginning of this last 10-minute flight down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 50,000 feet. They've gone through about a quarter of their fuel to get to where they are right now. And they are playing a 1960s high-tech game of Can You Hear Me Now? Because the radio isn't really working. They can talk to the ground for a few seconds, and then they get these huge blasts of static, and they don't know why or where the static is coming from. And even worse, it's not just the voice communication. All their data is dropping out too, and they need that second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth set of eyes. And so Armstrong and Aldrin have their heads down, and they're playing with the channel, and they're trying to adjust the antenna angle and doing all the things that you might do to try and fix a radio, to make your radio work. And fortunately, they have time to do that because they are not actually flying the spaceship. There is a new technology, a new cool thing that is flying that spaceship. It is called a computer. And the computer in that little spaceship it's just a brilliant piece of technology. It can do hundreds of calculations per second. And the reason they have a computer is that they're not just trying to generically land on the moon, they are trying to land at a particular pre-selected spot on the moon. Now, when they were planning the mission, there was a lot of controversy over where exactly they should land. On the one side, there were the geologists and the scientists who study the moon and rocks and things like that, and they were like, yeah, it's the Cold War, but this is the scientific opportunity of a lifetime. We have to land someplace geologically interesting. And on the other side, there were the astronauts and the rocket scientists, and they're like, cool, what's geologically interesting? And the geologists are, well, a mountainside, or a valley, or canyon, maybe the rim of a crater. In the end, it was the astronauts and the rocket scientists who won the argument, because this was about the Cold War, and you're not going to win the Cold War with your little spaceship sliding down the side of a mountain, are you? So Apollo 11 is aimed for the flattest, dullest, geologically most uninteresting spot that NASA can find on the moon, and the computer is flying them there. It is 4:10 p.m., about 5 minutes into the 10-minute last bit of flight. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 35,000 feet. They've gone through about 50% of their fuel, and good news! The radio is working. As mysteriously as the radio problems came, they just go away. And finally, the two of them have got to be thinking, okay, maybe this is going to go well from here, when a display in front of them lights up and it says 1202. 1202 is a message from their computer. Now, I know no one in this room is really that familiar with computers. They're really high tech. So let me give you a modern version of what 1202 means. Maybe this? This is a closure conference. This. The best part is, the people in mission control, they see the 1202, all this data is streaming down. Armstrong gets on the radio, it's like, 1202. What's 1202? Because there's 1,200 of these codes, right? Who knows? And so they're looking at each other, trying to figure out what 1202 is. And there's one guy in that room. He's 26 years old. His name is Steve Bales, and he knows what 1202 means. 1202 means that the computer has more to do than it can actually handle. But he also knows that the software is designed so that it'll do the most important things first and let the less important things fall off the table. So Bales, he's got like 5 seconds to make this decision. And it's literally a life or death decision. And he says, just ignore the 1202s. Just forget it. Just keep going. A little while later, Armstrong and Aldrin start getting 1201s, which Bales knows is pretty much the same thing. And so they're just telling them to ignore these error codes, but they can't. The astronauts can't quite ignore the error codes. They can't quite ignore them because there's a bad UI design. They have to push a button to clear the error code. It shows 1202, and then they have to push a button because, the next one might be 867, which means something completely different, and they can't see that unless they clear it. So they have their heads down, and they're pushing these buttons, trying to clear these error codes, and they're coming pretty fast and pretty furious. It is 4:12 p.m., about 7 minutes into the 10-minute flight. They're at 2,000 feet. They've gone through about 4/5 of their fuel. And as mysteriously as they come, the 1202s go away. The computer starts working fine. And finally, Armstrong has a chance to look up and look out the window. He's got this little triangular window in front of him. He looks out the window. Now they're at 2,000 feet. If you're going to Cleveland and you're at 2,000 feet, that means that the plane is coming in to land. Probably the landing gear is down, the flaps are down. 2,000 feet, you're almost at Cleveland. Cleveland's all around you. You can look out the window at 2,000 feet and see who has a swimming pool and whether it's trash day. 2,000 feet, Cleveland's not that place you're going to next week. It's a place. Armstrong looks out the window, and for the first time in human history, the moon is not that light up in the sky. It's not this geopolitical, we're going to kick the Russians' butts by getting there first thing. It's a place. It's all around them. He can see the ground scrolling beneath them. He can look in the distance and he can see mountains, and the mountains are higher than he is. He you are pretty much there when you're at 2,000 feet. Now, certainly when I was a kid, and probably even now, I sometimes imagine what it would have been like to be him, to look out that window, right? Step into his big, bulky spacesuit boots, right? And look out that window. And I think if I were looking out that window at that moment, there's only one word that would come to my mind. That word begins with S and rhymes with hit. The moon is a place. It's the wrong place. He looks out the window. Armstrong has been studying maps and photographs, and they actually made plaster models. He knows exactly what he should see when he looks out that window, and you know what? This isn't it. And furthermore, he can't see the right place from where he's looking. All he knows is it's the wrong place. And then it gets worse, because on that window, there are the markings, and he can use those markings as sort of a gun sight to tell exactly where on the ground the computer is going to have them land. And he lines up on the right marking and sees that, or something like that. A very geologically interesting crater. And even worse, the crater is not that big, but the crater is full of boulders. The crater is full of car-sized boulders, and there's a debris field. Remember, a crater is like, asteroid hit, right? There's stuff all over the place. And the crater is surrounded by this very large debris field of boulders. Armstrong looks at that for probably 5 seconds, and then he makes a very Neil Armstrong decision. He makes a very Neil Armstrong decision. He clicks off the autopilot, and he does two things. He kills most of their downward descent, and he guns it forward. Because on the far side of this boulder field, he can see that there might be a decent place to land, and he has got to get there before they run out of fuel. Back on Earth, the people in Mission Control, they can see all this. They can see him click off the autopilot. They can see him kill the downward fall. They can see him zooming forward, and they do something really remarkable. They do nothing, and they shut up. And in fact, the guy running the show at Mission Control, a guy named Gene Kranz, tells the people at Mission Control he doesn't want anybody talking to the astronauts anymore. He only wants them to send one bit of information up periodically. How much fuel do they have left? How much time do they have left before they run out of fuel? It is 4:14 p.m., about 9 minutes into that 10-minute flight. The astronauts are at 313 feet. They're down to 5% of their fuel, and they are just passing over the edge of that boulder field. They don't know how fast they're going because no one ever expected them to be going this fast, that low to the ground, so their speedometer is pegged. It's 4:16 p.m., 11 minutes into that 10-minute flight. They are at 30 feet, and Armstrong, they are over the boulder field, and Armstrong is slamming on the brakes to get them to stop so he can lower it the last little bit. They've got 3% of their fuel left, and the first ominous warning comes up from the ground. It's just 2 words, 60 seconds. You have 1 minute of fuel left. Armstrong barely hears them because he's now lowering the thing like a helicopter down to the ground. At a certain point, they lose track of how high they are because they're kicking up this huge cloud of dust. But he can feel it. It's down there. He knows the ground is down there somewhere. And it's about this moment that they hear the second warning, 30 seconds. For God's sake, land this thing. Aldrin is looking out the window, and he reports that he can see a big shadow on the ground. It's the shadow of the spaceship. They are really, really close. And then Aldrin looks down at his instrument panel, and there's a little light, a little amber light right in front of him, and it's labeled contact. And as he looks at that light, it comes on. It's a contact light. Contact light means that the sensors on the landing gear of this weird-looking little machine have touched something hard. Contact light means they've landed. Contact light means that Armstrong and Aldrin are not going to die, and better, they're not going to fail. Contact light means that these two guys, all the people at NASA, United States of America, that humanity has arrived. It's 4:17:41. But Armstrong and Aldrin are not quite done. The plan had been for them to shut off the engine just a few feet above the ground and let the thing fall the rest of the way, but they were too busy not dying to do that. And so now they're sitting on the ground, burning the last of their fuel, kicking up rocks and dust and what have you, and they need to go down their shutdown checklist. And it's something the two of them do together because it's really important to get it right, so they pair astronaut. So one of them will read the step and the other one will do it, or the first one will read the step and the other one will do it. So Armstrong starts it by saying shutdown, and Aldrin says, okay, engine stop. And then Aldrin says ACA out of detent. Armstrong says out of detent auto. And they go on through all this sort of technological mumbo jumbo. Meanwhile, back in Mission Control, they can see that the little lander has stopped. And they can see their version of the contact light come on. And then they see all the systems clicking off. And they can hear Armstrong and Aldrin going through this checklist. And you would think that at a moment like this, you know, someone would say something momentous, something profound. But that's not really how people are. So the guy on the ground who's talking to the astronauts, he radios up words to the effect, "We think you landed." Duh? Really? Armstrong is sort of still at the end of the shutdown checklist, so he clicks off the last thing on the checklist. He says, engine arm off, and then pretty much in the same breath, he says the words that he had practiced, the words that he had made up, the words that he wanted to be the first words from another world. So he says, Tranquility Base here. They had landed in a place on the moon called the Sea of Tranquility, we think, right? We're almost sure. The Eagle, which was the name of the little spaceship, has landed. And with those words, those highly disciplined, nerdy guys in Mission Control with their white shirts and their skinny black ties and their pocket protectors, as a group, stand up and start shouting. You can imagine there's probably some shouting going on in those cars. What would you do? Pound on the steering wheel a little bit, maybe? Feel a little silly if somebody sees you? Certainly there was some shouting going on in that row house. It takes the 10-year-old boy just a few seconds to realize, hey, they've done this. This is over. They've done it. And then he realizes that his dad is no longer in that crouch, but his dad is jumping up and down and shouting really loud, shouting louder than he's ever heard his dad shout before. Then he realizes it's not just his dad shouting, it's the people next door. And it's the people on the other side, and it's the people across the street, and it's the people on the back street. The whole neighborhood is shouting. And it's the kind of noise that you don't exactly hear as you sort of feel in your stomach. And it comes in waves. It'll be really loud, and then it'll sort of trail off, and you think it's going to end, and then no, it gets really loud again. And amidst all the shouting, the boy focuses back on the television and sees the second incredible thing of the day. Because there on TV, just for a second, camera cut away, but just for a second, he saw it. He was sure he saw it. There on the TV screen was Walter Cronkite crying. That's my story. Thank you. But I want to say something to you guys. I said that was my story, but it's not. It's your story, okay? You get that story for being one of us. Everything that I told you was done by people like us, done by people who live and breathe technology, who live just to build things, who live for the next cool thing. And I don't care if you grew up in the United States like I did, or Germany, or Asia, or the old Soviet Union, or Russia. If you are one of us, this story is part of your heritage, your cultural inheritance. So it's yours, and One of the reasons I try and tell this story as often as I can is to kind of give it back, to remind everyone that this is really your story. But I said that what I would do is try and talk you into the idea that this story is relevant to the things you're doing today. So let me try that. Can we learn anything from this story? I think we can learn all kinds of things. I think we can learn little things. And I think the little thing that we can learn is that little things in a complex technological project can kill you, okay? Let's think about the little things. Why did their radios stop working for a while? Right? There's an interesting question. Turns out that a few months before Apollo 11 took off, the rocket scientists who were responsible for this thing got worried about the steering rockets. Not that they would go on and stay on like they did in that early mission, but that they would burn through the side of this thing. Some of those steering rockets were pointed pretty close to the skin of this thing, and this was very flimsy. And so they put these shields, I've got one of them circled in yellow here. They put these shields to keep the rockets from burning through the side. So the shields would deflect the rocket exhaust. They also made great radio reflectors. And at certain angles, they would reflect the radio and screw up their communications. Guess which angles that was? Between minutes 10 and 7 of the flight down to the moon. Why did their computer crash? Their computer crashed because it had 3 modes, and there was a switch. You could select the mode. Mode number 1 was track the mothership, right? They used that mode when they were coming back up, right? Mode number 3 was landing on the moon mode, and that just tracked the ground. I don't care about the mothership. And then there was mode 2, which was just used very rarely, which was to track both of them. Well, they had it set in mode 2. The computer was trying to track both the ground and the mothership, and that ancient computer couldn't really walk and chew gum at the same time, and so it crashed. Little things can kill you. But you know what? Well-designed software can save you. The only reason they managed to land was because that software was designed to do the most important thing, so that they managed to get past that one. Even more interesting is, why were they off course? They had this pinpoint landing. What happened? For that, we have to go back a couple of hours to when the 2 spaceships were connected together. When these 2 spaceships were hooked together, there was a sort of tunnel that ran between the 2 of them so the people could pass back and forth. And when they got ready to separate, they closed the hatch at one end and they closed the hatch at the other, and they made a sort of dead space. And the astronauts were supposed to pump the air out of that dead space and then separate. Well, maybe they were in a hurry, maybe they had other things on their mind. They didn't quite get all the air out of it. So when they separated, there was a puff of air that changed the speed of the little lander by 1 foot per second. Here is 1 foot per second. Okay? That's 1 foot per second. What possible difference could 1 foot per second make in a spaceship going more than 1,200 miles an hour? Well, let's do the math. 1 foot per second is 60 feet per minute. It's 3,600 feet, more than half a mile, in an hour. And this was 2 hours before they landed. This problem festered for hours and threw them off course by a couple of miles. Little things can kill you. A little puff of air can kill you. But you know what else? If you look at those 2 spaceships, between them they had 2 million parts. If you tried to worry in detail about every single one of those 2 million parts, you'd probably be ready to leave for the moon about now, right? The key is not to worry about every single little detail. The key is to try and locate the details that are likely to kill you and be ready to deal with the failures that do occur. I think that's one of the lessons that we can get out of this. Another thing we can get out of this is the value of persistence. Think about all those early failures, right? I said, Ranger 3 is still out there, and we all laughed. It's funny, right? It probably wasn't funny to the people behind Ranger 3, and yet they kept going. They kept going through astronauts that were killed. They kept going through spaceships spinning out of control. They kept going through all kinds of things, and in the end, they managed to do it. We can also learn something. I think it takes leadership to do something like this, and I think leadership is really important. But I think there's something else that's important, something I like to think of as fellowship, right? We're all smart people in this room. We all have opinions. We all want to be heard. But there are moments when the best thing to do is to shut up and let the person who's on the spot make the decisions. Think about what happened when Armstrong took control of that spaceship. The people on the ground did not radio up to him. Neil, you've turned off your targeting computer. What's the matter? They just shut up and let him do the job. I think of that as fellowship. And I think, honestly, software people, right? I think we could practice a little more fellowship. I also think we need to know the difference between a leader and a hero. We like our heroes, right? Here's a very heroic moment. This photograph was taken a few hours after the landing. It's very heroic, and that's the problem with it. It looks like it was easy. It looks like there was like the super guy, and he flew to the moon, and he had no problems, and then he got out and took this photograph. We know that's not what happened. I like this because this reminds me of leadership. Remember the shutdown checklist? These are not the words of a hero. These are the words of a leader, of two people struggling to finish the job at the end of a really bad day, right? And I like these words. I like these words especially because, honestly, all this technological mumbo-jumbo, I could be saying this on Monday. It makes me feel closer to this thing. I could be saying this. You could be saying something like this. These are the words of people struggling to finish the job. And you know what else these words are? They are the first words spoken from another world. I like the fact that they're real words. They're not made-up words. They're actually something somebody was trying to do. We could also learn something about history and the way things work out from this story. See, we went to the moon, and we thought, well, we'd kick the Russians' butts while we're going to the moon, and we'd learn some things, and maybe we'd light up some dark places with our big machines and the fire and everything. And a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. We looked back over our shoulder, and we saw that. We saw ourselves. We saw our place in the universe. I know for probably everybody in this room, maybe, these pictures are just part of the wallpaper. I saw Alan earlier, and he was wearing a t-shirt that had a picture very much like this one, right? It's just part of the wallpaper. You see it all the time. You've seen it 1,000 times. I would like for you to try to imagine for just a minute that you had gotten to a certain place in your life having never seen a picture like that. And then one day somebody comes and slaps this picture down in front of you. How would you feel? What would you say? I can tell you. You look at it and you say, Holy Mother of God, that is everything. That is every birthday. That is every first day of school. That is every graduation. It's every love affair. It's every wedding. It's every wedding anniversary. It's every funeral. It's every birthday. It's everything we are. It's all we have. It's beautiful. It's tiny. It's out there in the black. And maybe we should take care of it. It's no coincidence that pictures like this coincided almost exactly with modern environmentalism as a mass political movement. You just look at the picture and it comes to you. And that sort of brings me to what I think of as kind of the real lesson of Apollo. And it's something I have a hard time putting into words. And mostly I can think of it as a conversation, maybe a conversation between you and me. We go out to lunch, and one of us, it doesn't matter which, has an idea, and it doesn't matter what the idea is, right? Maybe you want to get rich selling pet food on the internet. Maybe I want to mine the seafloor for minerals. Doesn't matter what the idea is, doesn't matter who had it. Maybe you want to cure the common cold or AIDS or cancer. It just doesn't matter. Maybe it's me. Now, we could talk about this idea, you and I, out at lunch. We could talk about this idea, and you could maybe tell me it's a bad idea. And sure, maybe I believe you. We could talk about it. You could tell me that it's bad for you, or It's not worth the money that it'll rot your teeth, or it'll make your hair fall out, or it'll ruin your eyesight. And we can talk about that, sure, it's, maybe. You could just tell me that, it'll make you fat, I don't know, right? All these things you could tell me, and maybe you could convince me of them. The one thing you cannot convince me of is that it is not possible. You see, I'm familiar with the impossible. I saw it done on TV when I was a kid. Right? The ultimate lesson of Apollo is that when you do something cool, if you do something difficult, you do something technically difficult, and you do it with style, you do it with grace, you do it with elegance, well, you have the thing, great. But there's the second effect. There is this wave that goes out from it. It is a wave of belief. You make people believe. If she can do it, I can do it. If he can do it, I can do it. You make people believe in the future. You make people believe in the possibilities. You make people believe in themselves. I can do it. I know this for a fact. I know this for a fact because I am the result of one of those waves. I am a child of Apollo. I sat on that couch and my life changed. Right? It got off of whatever path it was on, and it got on a different path that led me to college and to engineering and to computer programming, and later on to writing books, and a little while after that to being here with you today. The ultimate lesson for Apollo for me has really very little to do with space travel or the moon or any of that. It has everything to do with belief. And so for me, the ultimate lesson of Apollo goes back to the words all those decades ago that started it all in the beginning. We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Have a safe trip home.